She was walking toward the medical bay, and the arm wasn't hers. That was the first thing Trell registered, not the purple blood tracing a line across the polished deck plating with each step she took, not the absolute silence that had replaced what was usually a corridor full of 300 cadets changing shifts. The first thing his 6 eyes registered was that the arm was approximately 4 feet long, charcoal gray, and belonged to a species that stood 9 feet tall and had 5 others exactly like it. The arm, to be specific, belonged to War Master Caldron Thane. 3 days after his instructor nearly killed her friend, Myra Cross had walked into Combat Arena 9, dismantled the most decorated Rock commander in the Stellar Command Institute's 40-year history, and was now carrying the evidence to the medical bay at a perfectly normal walking pace. She had broken 3 training records before any of this happened. The records were the least interesting part of her resume now. Nobody stopped her. Trell pressed himself against the archive doorway. His documentation instincts said, "Record this." His survival instincts said, "Do not move." Both of them agreed on one thing. She could not see the way his skin had gone the particular shade of violet that his species produced under extreme stress, which was technically called threat-adjacent chromatic response, and which he personally called the color of wishing you had chosen a different career. She passed within 3 meters of his position. The dripping continued, regular, patient, like a countdown that had already finished. Stay close. What happens to a 9-foot War Master when someone touches his friend? That part comes next, and I've been documenting this since the beginning. 6 months earlier, Trell had arrived at Helix Tertius Station with 3 data pads, 47 pre-formatted intake forms, and a genuinely optimistic outlook on interspecies cooperation that has since been described, by Trell himself, as embarrassing in retrospect. His assignment was Documentation Specialist for Training Cohort 7 at the Stellar Command Institute. The Institute trained officers for the Galactic Defense Concordat, which meant it trained warriors mostly, from species that measured personal worth in combat records and regeneration rates, and the number of limbs one had ripped from opponents in formal duels. Trell was Yothic. His species measured personal worth in the accuracy of their filing systems. He fit in approximately as well as one would expect. Helix Tertius itself was a neutral station built on 6 rotating gravity rings, each calibrated to a different homeworld standard. The heaviest ring, Ring 2, ran at 1.8 standard gravities and belonged primarily to the Vrock contingent. Walking into it felt, Trell had noted in his personal log, like being very slowly compressed into a shorter, more stressed version of oneself. He avoided Ring 2 when possible. Combat Arena 9 was on Ring 3, moderate gravity. Electrified obstacle courses that cadets navigated under timed conditions, barriers cycling at regulated intervals, voltage calibrated precisely to sting without injury. It was, officially, a controlled environment, safe within parameters. Parameters, Trell would later document with considerable bitterness, depended entirely on whether someone had tampered with the controls. The first morning he saw Myra Cross, he very nearly misfiled her intake form. She was unremarkable in the way that empty space is unremarkable. You don't think about it until something moves through it faster than the laws of physics suggest is reasonable. 5 feet 7 inches, human female, brown hair, medium length, no ornamentation. Standard issue cadet uniform, slightly worn at the left knee. She had scars crossing both forearms and intersecting lines, shrapnel, the intake records said, age 12, colony raid, but she kept the sleeves down and Trell only caught a glimpse when she turned the form over to sign the back. She signed her name and handed the form back without making eye contact. Not rudeness, more like someone whose attention was already elsewhere, calculating something he wasn't part of. He filed her under H for human and moved to the next cadet. The next cadet was not easy to miss. Nico stood 3 feet tall and had crystalline fur. That's the most accurate translation, though fur undersells it considerably. The filaments caught light and refracted it, which meant that Nico functioned involuntarily as a small walking mood indicator. Right now, standing in the docking bay intake line surrounded by species averaging twice his height, his fur was cycling through a deep and oscillating blue that Trell recognized from the Livin Emotional Atlas as sustained anxiety with intermittent hope. He was from a garden world. His species' worst historical armed conflict was called the Soft Debate and lasted 11 days, during which both sides issued strongly worded pamphlets and one elder sprained an ankle. He was here on a diplomatic scholarship because the Galactic Defense Concordat wanted Livin mediators trained within military structures, which was, Trell thought privately, a wonderful idea that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what military structures actually looked like from the inside. Nico's fur was still blue when he reached the intake desk. It brightened, briefly, toward nervous gold when Trell greeted him in passable Livin. Then it went blue again when he looked over his shoulder at the crowded corridor behind him. That was when Trell first noticed the small, quiet shift in the line. The human cadet, the one he'd nearly misfiled, had moved, not dramatically, just repositioned. She was now standing between Nico and the largest cluster of rock cadets to their left, her back to him, her attention apparently on her data pad. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't looked at Nico. She'd just put herself in the way of something she'd assessed as a possible problem, and then gone back to doing whatever she'd been doing before. Trell filed this under minor behavioral note and moved on. He would later refile it under should have paid more attention to this. Warmaster Caldron Thane ran the combat division at Stellar Command Institute the way certain geological formations run river systems, by existing immovably and forcing everything else to root around him. He had 220 years of military service, 14 campaigns, 9 consecutive sector trial victories, and the absolute unshakable certainty of a being who had been told, "You are the standard," so many times that the concept of being below any standard had ceased to exist in his understanding of the universe. He was 9 feet tall on a bad day. On a good day, when his exoskeleton plates flared slightly with what Vrock anatomy produced in response to confidence, he was closer to 9.5. 6-limbed. The bioluminescent veins threading through his charcoal gray plates pulsed yellow when he was pleased. They pulsed yellow quite a lot. He had ritual combat scars on his lower left arm forming geometric patterns that Trell had been told by a Vrock cultural attaché represented 14 campaigns, 9 championships, and an entire philosophy of invincibility. His lower right arm showed no ritual scarring. That arm, the attaché had explained, was his least used fighting limb, purely functional, largely decorative. His voice, when he addressed cadets, produced a subsonic rumble that Trell's 4-chambered brain registered as nausea before it registered as sound. Non-Vrock species in his immediate vicinity tended to either go very still or find reasons to be elsewhere. Caldron interpreted both responses as appropriate deference. His favorite phrase, which Trell documented appearing 14 times in the first month, was decorative cargo. He used it to describe any cadet who came from a species without warrior culture. Diplomatic scholarship recipients, scientific track cadets, medical observers, decorative cargo. Trell documented this 14 times and submitted 2 formal objections. Both were filed, he was assured, under pending review. Instructor Garvin was Caldron's subordinate, which meant Garvin had approximately 1/3 of the Warmaster's imposing physical presence, and 3 times the enthusiasm for demonstrating it on anyone who couldn't fight back effectively. He taught the electrified course drills. He had a particular smile, Trell had documented it carefully, that appeared in the left side corners of his mouth when a cadet was struggling, and not when a cadet was succeeding. There was a word for that kind of smile in 4 of the 7 languages Trell documented fluently. None of them were complimentary. Myra Cross, in her first 6 months, broke 11 training records. Trell has the documentation. He reviewed it after everything, partly for completeness and partly because he needed to understand how he'd missed what was right in front of him. Record 1, fastest completion of the navigation blindfold drill, beating the previous holder by 43 seconds. Record 2, highest consecutive accuracy score in the zero-gravity marksmanship rotation, which required recalibrating her aim 47 times in a single session, because zero gravity kept shifting her position and she simply kept recalibrating. Record 3 came during the first combined species physical conditioning trial, when she ran for 6 hours at a pace that the Vrock cadets had reduced to a jog by hour 3 and stopped at entirely by hour 5. The Vrock physiologist on staff submitted a query to the Human Embassy asking whether this was normal. The Human Embassy responded after 3 days with a document titled Persistence Hunting, an overview and a brief note that read, "Yes, this is normal. We recommend hydration breaks." She hospitalized 3 sparring partners over 6 months, not maliciously. More like a person who had one setting and that setting was as hard as necessary, and her calibration of necessary ran considerably higher than most species' calibration of possible. One of them was a Thrin cadet, cybernetically augmented, twice her mass, who spent 4 days in the regeneration ward and told the medical team when asked what had happened simply, "She explained leverage to me." She never raised her voice during any of it, not once. And through all of it, the records, the sparring victories, the increasingly alarmed physiological reports, she ate breakfast every morning with Nico, reviewed his coursework with him in the afternoons, and had on at least 5 documented occasions stood in a corridor at a very specific angle when other cadets came around a corner, and found the angle less than inviting and went a different direction without quite being able to explain why. She helped 3 struggling cadets with their marksmanship scores in the 2nd month. She helped 2 more in the 4th. She asked nothing in return. Trell documented this with a note that read, "Unclear motivation, continue observation." He would later revise the note to read, "Motivation was clear, I wasn't paying attention." Nico showed Trell his data pad one afternoon in the Common Archive. He wanted to show it to someone. Myra was in a drill, and he seemed, Trell observed, like a being who had collected something beautiful and found the sharing of it nearly as good as the having of it. The data pad held drawings. Not technical sketches, actual drawings done in color with care, with the particular attention of someone who had looked at things very closely before drawing them. They were flowers. His garden world, he explained in careful galactic standard, had 43 species of flowering plant that produced scent as a form of emotional communication. The flowers didn't just smell, they signaled. The red striped ones meant safety. The pale blue ones meant grief. The ones that looked to Trell's visual processing like small white explosions of petals meant something Nico said was closest to the concept of "I am glad you exist." Nico was growing them from seed in his quarters. He'd brought the seeds in a sealed case. The academic quarter ended in 7 months. He was going home to plant a garden he'd been designing since he was 4 years old, and the design had apparently changed since becoming friends with a human because he'd added a new section. He showed Trell the new section, row after row of the white explosion flowers. "Myra taught me what the closest human concept was," Nico said. His fur cycled a warm, settled gold. "She said it was called 'I'm glad you exist.' She said humans don't have a flower for it." She seemed surprised that anyone did. Trell documented this and then sat with it for longer than he usually sat with documentation. It was 3 weeks after that conversation that Instructor Garvin cranked the voltage in Combat Arena 9 to 300% above regulation. Trell was at his observation station. He has reviewed his documentation records since. He was there. He saw Garvin's hand on the control panel. He saw the specific sequence of inputs that took the barriers from calibrated to catastrophic. He saw the small, satisfied arrangement of Garvin's expression, that left corner smile, as he stepped back from the panel and waited for the drill to begin. He filed a report that evening. It sits still in a pending review folder he no longer has access to. Nico was mid-jump when the barrier activated. The gap that should have been open was closed. The voltage that should have been at training level was not. The sound it made, Trell documented the sound because he documents everything. Because documentation is the only tool he has. Because 6 eye stalks and a perfect memory are not substitutes for the ability to intervene. The sound was something he will not reproduce in any official report. It was meat on a griddle. It was a current finding a path through something that was not designed to conduct it. It was a scream from a creature whose entire species had never developed a reflex for this specific kind of pain, because nothing on their garden world had ever been cruel enough to produce it. Nico flew backward 4 meters. He hit the safety padding, smoking. His fur had gone white. Trell had never seen it go white. It wasn't in the Livin' Emotional Atlas. He checked later in the expanded xenobiology database. It wasn't there either. The medics reached Nico in 40 seconds. Healer Sylph, Quarren, 7 tentacles, 3 hearts, the particular focused calm of someone who had chosen their vocation because they genuinely could not watch suffering continue, was among them, tentacles already sorting triage. They had Nico on a hover stretcher and moving toward Regeneration Ward Delta in under 2 minutes. Instructor Garvin watched from the side of the arena. His expression, Trell documented, did not change. Myra Cross had been standing at the equipment rack 30 meters away when it happened. She didn't run toward him, she didn't call out, she went still. Not the stillness of shock. Trell had documented shock responses across 11 species, and he knew what it looked like. This was something different. A predator stillness. The kind that happens when something that has been moving through a world has processed all available information and determined that moving is now unnecessary because the decision has already been made. She watched the medics carry Nico. She watched the stretcher disappear through the arena door. And then she turned her head and looked at Garvin, and Trell, who was watching everything and writing it all down, felt the particular sensation of observing something that no filing system had a category for. She was measuring him. Not the way a soldier measures a threat in the moment, more like the way someone measures a door frame before cutting lumber to fill it. Clinical, patient, already accounting for tolerances. Garvin laughed, said something about the little crystal rat needing to move faster next time. Myra said nothing. She picked up her practice rifle from the equipment rack and went back to the drill. Warmaster Caldron Thane's official incident report, filed the following morning, was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long in audio format and ran to approximately 300 words in transcript. Trell documented both versions. The report described equipment malfunction during standard training exercise, cadet injury consistent with calibration error, investigation initiated, standard protocols observed. It mentioned Garvin twice, both times as a witness, not as a participant. Not as the person whose hand Trell had watched on that control panel. Trell filed 3 reports that week. Report 1, factual account of what he'd observed, including the sequence of inputs he'd watched Garvin make. Report 2, a formal query about the status of the investigation. Report 3, a follow-up on reports 1 and 2. All 3 were returned with the same notation in the system. Pending review, Archive Division Query Q. Expected resolution 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days. He visited the regeneration ward that evening. Nico was in a suspension gel pod in Tank 3, small and pale in the amber liquid, his fur still cycling an unsteady white and gray that the medic on duty said represented high-stress stabilization. Healer Sylph was running assessments on a data pad. When Trell asked for a prognosis, Sylph paused, which was not how Sylph usually communicated. Sylph usually communicated in confident, precise sentences, and said, "The electrical damage is treatable. We are more concerned about the secondary indicators. The fear response in live-in physiology is not well studied in relation to targeted violence. Most live-in have never experienced targeted violence." Trell sat in the corridor outside Tank 3 for 40 minutes. Myra Cross arrived 2 hours after Trell had left for the evening. He knows this from the ward's visitor log, which he requested access to afterward. She sat beside Tank 3 for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The ward's audio documentation captured her reading aloud a story about rabbits from Earth, which Trell later located in the Human Cultural Archive. It was a quiet story, about small creatures and unexpected bravery and the complicated geography of home. She pressed her palm flat against the glass of the tank when she finished. Trell was not there for this, but the visual documentation was routine and he reviewed it. He watched Nico's small crystalline paw move to the same spot on the inside of the glass, and then he watched Myra's lips form a sentence, slowly and clearly, the way you speak when you know the person you're speaking to can't hear you but you need to say it anyway. He had the documentation team clean up the visual enough to read the sentence. "I'll fix this." She returned to her quarters at 2300 hours. Her roommate, Vixelian Cadet Thyra, left the room 40 minutes later with one bag packed, slept in a common space, and submitted a request for temporary reassignment the following morning, citing personal preference and listing no further explanation. The request was approved in 11 minutes, significantly faster than any of Trell's reports. 3 days passed. Trell documented them carefully because the absence of visible action was itself, he was beginning to understand, a kind of action. Myra Cross attended every class, completed every drill, scored within her normal range, which was to say above everyone else's normal range. She ate in the common hall. She helped a Thrin cadet named Jorix identify why his aim was pulling left under gravitational load, patient, specific, useful help, the kind that required paying close attention to someone else's problem. She nodded to Trell in the archive corridor on the second day and said, with complete ordinary politeness, "Good afternoon, observer, you look tired." He was objectively very tired. He had been sleeping 4 hours instead of his usual 6 and spending the rest of the time reviewing his filed reports, which continued to sit in their pending folders like letters to an address that no longer existed. Word was moving through the academy, the way certain things move, not through official announcements, not through deliberate communication, but through the organic transfer of awareness between beings who exist in close proximity and are not entirely without instinct. Trell caught fragments of it in corridor conversations, in the particular way groups redistributed themselves when Myra walked into a room. The human's friend was hurt. Command filed it away. The human went quiet. Certain species, Trell noted, seemed more responsive to this information than others. The Vrock cadets, who feared almost nothing as a point of cultural pride, were operating, he observed, with a slightly wider berth around Myra than they had been operating with before. The Thrin cadets, who ran probability matrices on every social interaction, appeared to have updated their calculations in some way that manifested as careful eye contact avoidance. Cadet Jorix, who had, as Trell documented, 0 biological fear response, a Thrin combat augmentation point of pride, was locking his quarters door at night. Trell knew this because Jorix's door lock appeared on the building's security log, and Trell had access to the building's security log. He had access to a great many things, very few of them were useful. The night before the third day ended, Myra sat in her quarters and mended a torn seam on her uniform sleeve. This was documented by the routine security visual, nothing flagged, no incident. She sat at her desk under the small lamp and she took her time with it, and she did it neatly, and she set the uniform down when she was done and went to sleep at exactly her usual hour. Trell reviewed this footage at 3 in the morning and could not articulate why it disturbed him more than anything else he'd recorded that week. Something about the patience of it, something about the care. He was still thinking about it when he arrived at Combat Arena 9 the following morning to document what the schedule listed as a routine demonstration by Warmaster Caldron's personal combat squad. The arena was not doing routine anything. Myra Cross was already there. She was standing on the arena floor, unarmed, in standard duty uniform, approximately 30 meters from where Warmaster Caldron Thane was running his squad through a weapons demonstration. She had not announced her presence. She was simply there, the way a fact you haven't quite processed yet is there, waiting in the background of your thinking while you're focused on something else. The squad noticed her first. 7 cadets, various species, all combat-tracked, all went quiet within approximately 10 seconds of registering her position. The demonstration continued for another 40 seconds before Caldron registered the change in his cadets' attention and turned to follow their collective line of sight. He looked at her, he looked at the space around her, no weapon, no formal challenge marker, nothing that under Academy protocol constituted an official action of any kind. His bioluminescent veins pulsed yellow. He crossed all 6 arms in a configuration that the Vrock cultural database listed as relaxed confidence, but that looked, to Trell's documented eye, significantly less relaxed than the entry suggested. The little Deathworlder finally shows spine. His voice carried across the arena easily. It always did, subsonic resonance having a way of filling spaces whether or not it was invited to. You here to file a complaint? We covered that. Equipment fails, accidents happen, your pet should be more careful. Myra didn't move. She stood the way she'd stood by the equipment rack 3 days ago, after the current and the screaming and the white fur. The way predators stand when the decision has already been made and movement is simply a matter of timing. Nico isn't my pet. Her voice was conversational, completely, entirely conversational. He's my friend. There's a difference. Caldron made a sound that was approximately a laugh if you ran the sound of tectonic plates through a translation matrix. Your choice of companions seems poor. Perhaps the military isn't the place for fragile creatures. Myra tilted her head, a small, considering movement, like someone checking an answer they'd already calculated against the working they'd already done. You're right, she said. This environment is dangerous. A pause, barely a second. Accidents happen all the time, don't they, War Master? Trell's skin went violet from his collar to the top of 2 eye stalks before he remembered to control the response. She knew, she had known for 3 days exactly what she was going to do. And she had attended class and drilled and eaten in the common hall and helped Jorix with his aim and mended her uniform sleeve with the particular calm of someone who has already arrived at a destination and is simply waiting for the address to catch up. She had been counting, Trell realized, watching her. He read her lips. She was still counting now, standing on that arena floor, looking up at 9 feet of regenerating Vrock certainty. The number her lips formed, very quietly, before she moved was 4. Caldron Thane crossed all 6 arms and waited for the human to explain herself. She didn't explain herself, she moved. 10 feet of distance disappeared in under a second. Not a sprint, not a lunge, something more efficient than either. The kind of movement built by a million years of chasing prey across open ground and never quite stopping. Caldron's upper 2 arms came down in a block that would have ended most confrontations on contact. She was already gone. Dropped low inside his guard, drove her right fist into his knee joint from the lateral side, with everything her legs and hips had loaded behind it. The sound was a gunshot. Caldron's knee hyperextended backward, not a natural direction for any joint in any species Trell had documented. His roar hit the arena walls and returned as a pressure wave that made Trell's eye stalks ache at their bases. 3 cadets in the observation area covered their ears. 1 Thrin simply walked out without a word. Smart animal. Caldron swung his upper left arm in a horizontal arc, the kind that would separate a smaller being's head from its shoulders or introduce its spine to several unwelcome configurations. Myra rolled into it. Let her shoulder take the impact, used the momentum to tumble sideways, came up on her feet 6 meters away, breathing steady. Trell watched her wince, she didn't stop. Caldron charged, all 6 limbs, 9 feet of exoskeleton-armored Vrock closing ground in 3 strides. The bioluminescent veins in his plates had gone past yellow into a frequency that suggested this had stopped being a demonstration of anything except anger. Myra stepped toward him, inside his reach. Closer than any rational being gets to an enraged Vrock in motion. She ducked his upper arms simultaneously, blocked his lower left with her forearm, the scarred one, shrapnel, age 12, colony raid, and drove the heel of her palm directly into his throat with her full body weight committed to it. Caldron gagged, stumbled. His forward momentum became a problem for him. She grabbed his lower right arm, his least used limb, no ritual combat scars. The Vrock cultural attaché had mentioned its structural vulnerability to Trell in month 2 in passing over a filing query. He had no record of Myra ever speaking to that attaché. She had worked it out herself from observation, from watching how Caldron moved across 37 documented training sessions. She planted her left foot against his hip, set her right foot behind her, and wrenched. Not pulled, the word is not pulled. She used her entire body, legs driving through the floor, core rotating, back engaged, every system humans carry for applying force over sustained distance converted into a single explosive vector. Built for persistence hunting, built for endurance. built for exactly this kind of leverage across exactly this kind of joint. The sounds that followed are documented in Trell's official record as joint separation event multi-tissue involvement. In his personal log, something he will spend the rest of his career trying not to hear when he closes his eyes. Caldron went to one knee, 5 remaining limbs pulled toward the wound. The sound that came from him was not a combat roar, something older, something that had never expected to exist in a being who had survived 14 campaigns believing the universe would keep agreeing with him. Purple blood on the arena floor, the same color as the drops Trell had watched trace a line across the corridor deck plating that morning before he understood what had produced them. He understood now why she had been counting. 4, the number her lips had formed before she moved. 4 days since Nico's injury. 4 minutes and 20 seconds of Caldron's dismissal report mentioning Garvin twice as a witness and 0 times as a cause. She had not come here in rage. She had come here at the end of a calculation running 72 hours behind a perfectly maintained face, through classes and drills and careful marksmanship help, and a torn uniform sleeve mended patiently the night before. Myra stood holding 4 feet of rock arm, breathing hard. She looked at Garvin, who had gone the pale shade that meant his species had redirected all blood from non-essential surfaces toward vital organs. Tell your instructor Nico says hello. Security arrived in 40 seconds. Officers shouting things shaped like commands. Myra walked past all of them, and they parted because the combination of what she was carrying and what her expression was doing produced, in each of them individually, the same calculation Jorix had run in the corridor. Nobody wanted to be next. She walked the main corridor at her normal pace. The arm dripped purple on the polished deck with each step, the same regular patient interval Trell had registered from the archive doorway, now with everything behind it accounted for. Cadet Jorix saw her first, pressed himself to the wall, did not breathe until she passed. 3 security officers watched from the junction ahead. All 3 waited 47 seconds after she cleared their position before filing anything. The comm log reads, Cadet Cross Myra, proceeding to medical bay, no active threat, no intervention required. None of them noted the arm. Trell has the log. The medical scanner flagged her at the bay entrance. Unregistered biological material detected. Please report to security. Myra looked at the scanner, looked at the arm, looked back. It's registered now. The scanner did not argue. Healer Sylth's 7 tentacles stopped moving simultaneously. 3 hearts. Trell is speculating on the 3rd, but he has documentation for the physiological signs of at least 2 disruptions in that moment. I need to see Nico, Myra said, polite, specific. Sylth looked at her, looked at what she was carrying. The tentacles resumed movement. Tank 3, same as before. Thank you, you're genuinely good at this, I want you to know that. Nico was awake, reading his data pad, the flower drawings, the garden design with its new section. He looked up when she approached. His crystalline fur shifted to happy gold immediately, automatically. 6 months of friendship condensed into an involuntary warmth response. Then he saw what she was carrying. 4 colors in 2 seconds, then something Trell had no atlas entry for. He left the field blank. Wrote, requires new entry, may require new category. Myra pulled up a chair, set the arm on the floor, leaned toward the tank speakers. Hey buddy, feeling better? Yes, out tomorrow, his small voice through the speakers. Myra, what is that? Used to be attached to War Master Caldron. He'll grow a new one in 8 weeks. You took his arm. He let his instructor hurt you, said it was an accident, said you were too fragile. She leaned forward. So I showed him what fragile actually means. Nico's fur steadied on that unnamed color. She pressed her palm flat against the tank glass. His small crystalline paw moved to the same spot on the inside, same position, same pressure, as the night she'd read him the rabbit story and said the sentence Trell had needed the documentation team to clean up enough to lip read. I'll fix this. She had. Admiral Voris arrived with 6 security officers and found Myra sitting beside the tank, reading the rabbit story at the page she'd apparently left off. Cadet Cross, you assaulted a superior officer. Myra set the data pad down, stood, came to attention. Yes, Admiral. You ripped off his arm. His lower right arm specifically. 5 others remain functional. 8-week regeneration confirmed for Vrock of his physiology. The Admiral stared, the kind of stare that had historically produced urgent business elsewhere in junior officers. Myra's expression did not change. I also understand, Myra said in the same level tone, that unauthorized modification of training equipment resulting in cadet injury is a serious offense, as is submitting an incident report that omits material facts. as is maintaining a hostile training environment for cadets on diplomatic scholarship protected under the Living Cultural Exchange Compact, Article 7. A measured breath. I filed 3 reports within 24 hours, all returned to pending. No corrective action in 72 hours. Academy Statute 12(9) Alpha, subsection B, cadets authorized to employ reasonable force against ongoing threats when command fails to act. Threat was ongoing, no permanent damage inflicted. The room held its quiet. A large number of beings had arrived at the same calculation, and nobody wanted to be first to say the answer aloud. Garvin was discharged dishonorably within 48 hours. Caldron spent 8 days in medical. The Galactic Nets ran the story for 2 weeks. Philosophy departments at 3 universities submitted papers. The third concluded the 2 questions everyone was asking were the same question. Trell thought that was probably correct. 8 weeks later, Caldron walked onto the training grounds while Myra ran drills. She stopped, wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, waited. He crossed all 6 arms over his chest and lowered his head. Full formal Vrock bow reserved, the cultural database said, for warriors of equal or greater standing after a legitimate engagement. The bioluminescent veins in his plates pulsed blue-white, not yellow, recognition. You have honor, small warrior. I failed in my duty to this institution and to the cadets in my charge. You identified the failure and corrected it. This is the way of warriors. Myra blinked, one small genuine beat of surprise, the first unguarded expression Trell had recorded from her in 2 months. Thank you, War Master. The strongest blade is tempered in the hottest fire, he straightened, all 6 limbs settling into something less formal. Your friend is fortunate in you. He turned to leave, paused at the doorway, looked back. I will note you identified my lower right joint correctly. I have wondered for some years whether it was obvious. It wasn't, she said. I had to think about it. Something like satisfaction arranged itself across his features. Then he walked away without another word. She looked directly at Trell's position, which he had believed to be unobserved. You're going to document that. Professionally obligatory. Good, write it down exactly. The new regulations appeared in the Academy Handbook 11 weeks later, inserted with the administrative discretion of changes nobody wants to announce but everyone knows are necessary. Dual officer approval for equipment modifications. Mandatory independent investigation for training injuries. Designated safety monitors for diplomatic scholarship cadets during high-risk exercises, officially titled Cultural Liaison Observer Protocol, unofficially called the Don't Make Humans Angry Act by everyone who knew the story. The Yothic Diplomatic Corps issued an updated species assessment. Trell received it on a quiet afternoon between routine filings, the way most important things arrive, without announcement, between ordinary moments. Human social bonds formed by choice are substantially stronger than bonds formed through obligation or biology. Response to threat against chosen bond recipients. Escalation without ceiling, persistence without degradation, proportionality frameworks non-applicable. Rule 1, do not harm their friends. Rule 2, seriously, did you not read Rule 1? He filed it under H, added a note, I read Rule 1, I watched someone else learn it the harder way. Nico left at end of quarter from docking bay 7. Myra had helped him pack the night before. His system, he explained, prioritized emotional significance over volumetric efficiency. She stood beside him at the bay in the same position as 6 months ago, between him and the crowd, saying nothing. His fur held that unnamed color the entire time. He held up the seed case before boarding. Through the small window, 43 species in careful Livin script, plus 1 new entry in careful phonetic English. She raised one hand. He raised his small crystalline paw. The boarding ramp sealed. Trell walked back through the main corridor alone, past the junction where 3 officers had once made a careful decision, past the stretch of deck that had carried purple drops in a patient, regular line. The plating was clean now. The afternoon light came through the external panels. He stopped at the viewport. Below, the docking bay. Beyond it, the station's outer hull. Beyond that, a ship growing smaller against the dark, carrying 1 passenger home to plant something with no name yet in any official taxonomy. The viewport held 2 reflections simultaneously, the empty corridor behind him and the stars ahead. Both perfectly still.